Alright, let's start updating our teams. We have made 2 videos of Rapi already. The numbers talk about it, how she worked, the overload strategy. That one was like a full guide. But let's make another one with the team. Yeah, we never really got to update all the good teams. Yeah, so the updated campaign basically starts off with this pretty much simple premise that Rapi is Burst 1, and then Crown and Naga. And then from there, really, it depends on what the content is, right? Is Modernia is a good wave clear, and then you use Red Hood for the boss, and then or you can use the Scarlet Black Shadow with Alice. That's the main thing, or Red Hood and Alice, or even Red Hood and Scarlet Black Shadow. Could be either or those, but that ends up being the setup for campaign. Now, if it's fire advantage, I guess it would be something like this, right? Where you would use Rapi and Modernia and Alice, but maybe if the boss, or maybe you would use Rapi Red Hood as the DPS instead, and then you would use Litter. And then if it's iron advantage, then you would use Red Hood instead. You can take advantage of the elemental advantage, but with pretty much like Scarlet Black Shadow, Red Hood, Alice, and then you have Cinderella also for electric. You can take advantage on pretty much almost every single element. The only difference one I would say would be is water, but the thing about water is there's not many good for campaign. Like Ludmilla and is not that great. Maybe you could use Quency, but even then, not many people have Quency invested that are also luxury on it, and at that point, you're probably gonna be better off just using the other range units or AoE units like Red Hood, Alice, Modernia, even Scarlet Black Shadow to a certain degree. So like right now, water is kind of down there. Yeah, Cinderella is also really good on neutral. Speaking of which, talking about who are the strongest ones on neutral right now, it would be these 3. Scarlet Black Shadow, Rapi Red Hood, and Cinderella are actually roughly all in about similar level of the strongest neutral damage without even considering not considering like the AoE or anything, but like in terms of boss damage. If you include the AoE, actually Rapi would be a little ahead of them, mainly because Cinderella's damage and Scarlet Black Shadow's damage is much more constrained within focused damage, but Rapi has like that splash. Do we have water weak stages? Nihilister. Even then though, for Nihilister, the good ones to use on Nihilister would be Red Hood and Alice, because they have double the damage on parts. The Nihilister's parts last longer, and then by the time you destroy the parts, you would like change face already. So they are effectively elemental advantage because they're doing 2 times damage because of Pierce. I believe for Nihilister, I was using Red Hood with Ludmilla. But yeah, the campaign is basically, you have Crown, Naga, and then Rapi Red Hood. And then pretty much like pick your best DPSs. Red Hood, Scarlet Black Shadow, Alice, Cinderella, and Modernia. These are all primarily the main ones. And fine, okay, whoever wants to say, but I use Asuka. Okay, good. Jesus. Those are campaign and tower. Cinderella has replaced Moderna for me in triple DPS. Yeah, I mean, if you have like more investment on Cinderella, that's one thing too also. The main thing why Modernia is good is for her burst. So if you're not using burst with Modernia and like in an AoE form, Modernia will be out on the campaign. So like for bossing, I wouldn't really use Modernia actually. But if there's like a lot of enemy and at the beginning and you want to clear all those enemy for a long period of time, Modernia is great for that. And in fact, you could even alter, and if there's like a long period of AoEs that you have to do, you could alter between Modernia and Rapi, and have litter as the burst 1 instead. Yeah, the machine gun for Modernia is pretty clutch, especially if those hit counters that you need to do multiple hits. So litter is still not really extremely like retired, yeah, especially if you want to use Rapi as the burst 1. But otherwise, for burst 1 category, she pretty much replaced litter. Now, without Rapi, I actually personally like using Red Hood as the burst 1. So like my other default team is actually this team in particular, where I use Modernia with Red Hood as the burst 1, and then Modernia burst first, and then typically this will clear the whole map, and then boss spawns, and then I would use Alice to kill the boss. That's like my most basic like short fight. If the fight ends within like two bursts, this is my setup. Now, if the fight lasts longer than that, then that's when I start putting in Rapi Red Hood as the burst 1, and then flip around the DPSs around, whichever one the stage needs. Now, if you don't have Crown, as I get it, not everybody will have Crown, then you're gonna be back to using Tia, and then you're using Naga as the B2. Because this is like the setup, basically. And for any other DPSs, it would be really weird if you don't have all of those, especially Alice is given for free now. So assuming that you do have Alice, and then we have Rapi Red Hood, right? And then Naga is something you can select on the thing. Now, the free-to-play one I could totally see is like something that would look like this, because Litter and Naga are available to be selected, and then you have Alice. So a completely new player that has, let's say you have Rapi Red Hood, you can select Litter in the standard banner and Naga in the standard banner as well, and Alice also in the standard banner. So this is actually the F2P setup with Rapi Red Hood counted, and then you would just use Tia. Speaking of which, right, then you would do this selector actually with the funny thing, I haven't done it yet. All right, let's do this, boys. So let me grab this real quick. Hold up. before I forget. Let me get, oh my god. Got 10 Zwei. Okay, 2k right here. Let's see it. Oh my god, another one. Who? Marciana? Oh wait, I'm getting spare bodies. Yeah, you just do this step so you get this, and then I guess like a completely free to play. If you're starting off as a new player also, that setup is good because, okay, you in this wish list, right, you have Litter. You can select Litter, Naga, and Alice. And actually, Alice is free because there's the mission right now that should be available. So it's actually mainly Litter and Naga. And then for this one, then you can, assuming that you don't have Crown, I would then pick Tia for this. Yeah, this is definitely, the selector is definitely worth for people that don't have, especially if you're like completely just starting. You do this, select this, and go for, yeah, pick Tia for that one, assuming that you don't have Crown. Yeah, so this is like, if you're starting off like a completely brand new player, this is probably what I would suggest. Then you got Alice for free, and then you can select Litter and Naga on the standard banner. You have Rapi Red Hood to start with, and then you have Tia. Now, the next step is obviously you would do this with Crown, if you have Crown. And then, assuming that you do have other DPS, you don't necessarily have to invest in Litter right now. And you can use Rapi as the burst one. Actually, no, for newer players, it might be a bit difficult to use Rapi as the burst one. Actually, now that I think about it, because if you are actually a new player, you don't have access to overloads, and Rapi as burst one, and then your overload is, you're gonna be struggling on resources, right? So this is actually not bad. So here's one thing why this is also nice, right? Rapi is using Elysian gears, Alice is using Tetra gears, and then you have your pilgrim gears here. There's nothing that's like stealing from each other. And I mean, obviously, if you have Red Hood, then you could totally use this, right? And you would have Rapi as your burst one. You have this. But the biggest issue before is that on the Pilgrim attacker side, it was like there's so many people on demand. You have Modernia, you have Scarlet Black Shadow, you have Red Hood. It was all eating up the overloads for Pilgrim attacker that it was difficult to upgrade somebody. But this time around, at least like since they're not really overlapping, it's actually kind of nice. So it's a little bit easier to build the team in this way. But yeah, for newer players, I could totally see them starting to invest on litter first until they have more resources everywhere else. Alice might be a little bit difficult to invest on also, and I could totally see people just like doing this also. If you have like Red Hood, you could use this setup also. But Rapi Red Hood basically put in the position she can be burst 3 or burst 1, whichever situation people can set up that. So that's campaign and main tower. Now for Elysian Tower, it's a little bit whichever really what you have, but this is my current Elysian Tower. For burst 2, I switch around Diesel, or Marciana or Mast. Personally, I kind of like Diesel a little bit more. And then D for the burst 1, and then I would use Rapi burst and Maid Brevity. But Maid Brevity is just mainly because I have her invested as well, and her AoE is relatively decent also. But you don't have to use Maid Brevity, you can actually use other units as well. But the most transferable unit here is Maid Brevity because you can use her in the shotgun team as well. And then I have Maiden here for the fast charge energy gain. Now, if you end up needing healing, then I wouldn't blame it to start using Helm. So this is like, but Rapi is basically the core burst 1 main, burst 3 main DPS. Now, if you don't have the killer wife, personally, I would probably try to use either Miranda and Zwei and then use Summer Helm for the burst 2 for the cooldown reduction. And I would use like Miranda or Zwei, and they're just mainly there for filler as the B1, so that Rapi will be the burst 3. Because again, you do want Rapi to be burst 3 in your setup so that she will be the she's like your main DPS for that. With all else fails, then you know, if you don't have any other burst one, it is what it is. You're gonna have to end up using Rapi and then just use someone else. And I would probably I could probably use something like this, where I would use Rapi as burst 1, Diesel as burst 2, and then I just made Brevity, and then maybe I would use Helm for healing. And that doesn't have to be Diesel again. I would flip-flop on these. Diesel, Marciana, Mast, Summer Helm. These are all fairly decent to use for Elysian Tower. So that was campaign / tower. Now let's jump into Interception, which I think a lot of people are very curious on what's the new updated teams. Kraken. This is the main team that I'm using on Kraken, actually. And you can replace Alice with Summer Sakura and it would be just perfectly fine. But Scarlet Black Shadow is the core of that. Now, assuming that you don't really have Scarlet Black Shadow, I mean, you're gonna have to start settling down with the other units. Yeah, you have to use Red Hood, Alice, Summer Sakura, whichever one. But really the core of the Kraken is Scarlet Black Shadow. So you definitely should pull for Scarlet Black Shadow if you don't have it yet, because Kraken is one of the ones that you're going to be farming for a really long while. The replacement for Crown is then you would use Tia. Really, for anything that if you don't have Crown and you have Naga, for all of these, you're going to be using Tia. Because you're going to be switching back to the Tia Naga setup. Now, moving on to Mirror Container, this one is a little bit jumping, but this is probably the one where you might not end up using actually Rapi Red Hood, mainly because the team is kind of set up differently. I would say this is the main team, but you can still use Rapi Red Hood as the burst one. It's actually not that bad. And this is the one that I would like swap around so many because there's so many good electric units right now. So for example, for these setup, you could end up like using Cinderella, Summer Niece, and Maiden, but then, you know, some people don't have Maiden invested, and maybe you could end up like using Ein instead, and then you would set up this, and then you don't necessarily have to have like a third B3. You could end up setting up a setup where you're using Naga and Crown instead, and then you would use Rouge with Summer Niece and Cinderella. But the main core of it is pretty much like you're rotating in terms of your B3 usages. It would be Cinderella, Summer Niece, and then Ein, I would say, are the main ones, and Maiden. So you have like a lot of options there. Now, if you don't have those as burst trees, then I would jump around with these traditional ones. Like I mentioned, you could end up going back to what you were using in Kraken. You could end up using Red Hood also. But basically, yeah, you're just swapping around with the core units. It's the same units also that are good for campaign, minus Modernia. Because bossing, Alice, Red Hood, Cinderella, Scarletback Shadow, those are the main ones as like the good neutral. And I mentioned already before which are the good neutral ones, right? And you can actually also use Rapi Red Hood as the neutral as well. For Indivilia, this one pretty much jumps around, but I think one of the main ones I would say would be this, where you have Rapi as the burst one, you have Alice and then Asuka, and then Naga bonus core with Crown. The only other exception that I would say that would be not gonna work out is using Red Hood in particular. Because if you use Red Hood, the boss has bonus damage to Iron Code Nikke, so like the Red Hood strategy would not work out as well. But otherwise, the setup for this boss is similar also to the previous ones, where you can use like Scarletback Shadow with Alice, and then Rapi Red Hood as B1 if you don't have any others. But you can also use Asuka because she would actually help out with the fire. But you would use Rapi Red Hood as the B1 here. Now if you don't have enough of the other DPS, then you can still use the Killer Wife as your B1, but she's not gonna do as well as Rapi Red Hood, and then using just another DPS. And from there, like if you don't have really anything else, Cinderella is still pretty solid. Scarletback Shadow, Cinderella, these are good neutral ones to use, but it is with your best interest to take advantage of that bonus core damage. So Ultra, this is the fun one, because this one is actually pretty much a variable now. You can actually use a lot of different combinations here. Summer Helm is one of the better ones as the sub for this instead of Naga, but you can use Naga instead of Summer Helm also, assuming that you're using Crown. If you don't have Crown, then you're gonna end up with using the TS setup. As usual, the core would be Red Hood and then Rapi Red Hood. But there are so many different ways to defeat Ultra that it's actually possible to just use other different ones, right? You could use Red Hood with Snow White, and then instead of using Naga, then you can use Summer Helm as mentioned earlier. And then other substitute for Snow White is Maxwell. You can use Maxwell. And instead of Maxwell, you can also use a Treasure Laplace. In particular, the reason why Laplace is good for Ultra in particular is Ultra does have really high defense, so her true damage does come in handy in this situation. I would say these are the main ones to take advantage of. But with Rapi Red Hood, she can be used as the burst one or burst 3 in this situation. Finally, we have Harvester. You can use this team with the traditional Crown and Naga, and then you would just end up swapping out with quency, ludmilla. You can also use phantom and guillotine. They're all very viable in this boss. Personally, if you're looking for that clear, I would just wait until the next like pilgrim tier level water. That's really what we're missing right now for water, a pilgrim tier level of water. Right now we have fire and iron as the highest with Rapi, and then you have Cinderella for electric, and then you have Scarlet Black Shadow for wind. So the one that's really missing is actually water. And then if you don't really want to invest on them, it's still fine to invest and use ludmilla, and then you can just use whichever one that's good on neutral. Right, we have Cinderella, we have Scarlet Black Shadow, we have Alice, we have Red Hood. I would go in the order. Maybe I would go with Cinderella and then Scarlet Black Shadow while ludmilla is there. And then your B1 is basically Rapi Red Hood. But assuming you don't have that much other options, then yeah, you can use like Litter with Rapi Red Hood as the neutral DPS, because again, Rapi Red Hood is also viable as a neutral DPS as well. But yeah, those are the main ones. We have campaign, we have tower, we have anomaly, interception. Those are the main ones that I would say Rapi Red Hood has kind of changed the setup now. For the most part, it's still actually relatively similar, except like, okay, wherever we use litter, we just use Rapi Red Hood. But in some situations, you could end up just using also Rapi Red Hood as the burst 3 main DPS as well. Now do PvP, or you guys do... By the way, did you know that 56% of you still hasn't subscribed yet? Make sure to click that subscribe button, click that bell notification, leave a comment, like, and subscribe.